you. Thank you. All right, Clerk Gumow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We'll start with Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker. Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs. Crosby. Here. Ms. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Thank you. Mrs. Gorel.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
He was up there.
Mr. Kelly.
He's on mute.
We will return. Mr. Lindmark.
Present.
Mr. McCarthy.
Present.
Mr. McDonald.
Here.
Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Neighbors. Mrs. Red. Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassoni.
Present.
Mr. Webster. Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Rena.
Here.
Mr. Billich.
Here.
One more time for Mr. Kelly.
Tell him to unmute himself.
Mr. Chairman, we have 17 present, 3 absent.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. And Mr. Kelly, if you can unmute your microphone.
Here.
All right.
Yay.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to number 3 is our invocation and pledge. Tonight, we have the honor of County Board Member Angie Gorel. Everyone stand, please.
Lord, inspire us this evening with the qualities of good leadership. Give us insight to make wise decisions, integrity to face the truth, courage to make a difference, choices and compassion for the needs of others. Make us a model of justice and honor to the community. Help us always to act in the best interest of the people we serve. Please watch over the first responders, men and women who have generously given of themselves to protect the community and our country, so we can continue to enjoy our God-given freedom. Amen.
Amen.
I
Pledge
pledge
allegiance
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Gorel. That was wonderful. Mr. Thompson, are there any public speakers signed up this evening?
No one has signed up to speak, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. All right, well, number 5, can I entertain a motion to go into meeting of the whole, please? Mr. Hoffman motions to go in. Is there a second? Ms. Gorel seconds the motion. Is there any discussion on the motion? Hearing none. Clerk Gumow, can you please call the roll?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. We'll start with Mr. Butita.
Here.
Mrs.
yes,
Crosby.
Yes.
Ms. Fellers.
Yes.
Mr. Gurl.
Yes.
Gorel.
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman.
Yes.
Mr. Kelly.
Yes.
Mr. Lindmark.
Yes.
Mr. McCarthy.
Yes.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors still absent. Mrs. Red. Yes. Mr. Salgado.
Yes.
Mr. Schultz.
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni.
Yes.
Mr. Webster.
Yes.
Mr. Westcott.
Yes.
Mr. Rena.
Yes.
Mr. Billich.
Yes.
Chairman, that is 18 yes and 2 absent.
Very good. We are in session for the meeting of the whole. Number 6, this evening's meeting is about a discussion from the Health Strategy Prioritization. It will be hosted by Dr. Sandra Martell from the Winnebago County Health Department. Dr. Martell, you have the floor this evening.
Thank you, Chairman. And first of all, thanks to all for giving up a little bit of another night of their personal time to kind of work with us on this. Every 5 years, the local health department we're required to do what's called a community health assessment and a community health improvement plan. And so part of this tonight is really kind of identifying what the themes came out of all the assessments, and then having you help us as the elected representative officials of the county work through what that prioritization is. So I'm going to first of all like to introduce Peter LePage, who is our director of data and quality, who's leading this effort. And I want to tell you, this started before COVID, and we've continued it throughout. We were virtual, but the good thing is we've been able to come back into some in-person prioritization. So I think that's going to be an important step in this. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit about what this community health collaborative is, because you're going to hear a lot about several different entities. We all have to do health assessments, how we're going to bridge those together. The assessments that were done to date, there's a very prescribed process as part of being both a local certified health department in the state of Illinois and a nationally accredited health department. What the strategic issues that came out, and I'm sure you will not be surprised, but always the challenge is figuring out which is the most important to start working on. And then how do we align with the last time we did this? You know, it's hard to believe that what we came back with through the last time, and then an exercise that we're going to go through. The goal of this is to be done in as short a timeline as possible, so you can use really what I need from you is putting on your thinking caps and really working through that prioritization. What does it mean for us to be working on these activities? Because this will guide the health department over the next 5 years. And it really does identify how we spend our resources, in addition to little grants, and of course, throw in a COVID, a campfire for a couple other things, just for a little added excitement for the year. But it really does, when we come back to what are the things that we're going to work on using our energy, our resources, and our talents in the health department. So next slide, please. Give you a little context. Every certified health department in the state of Illinois must go through what's called the IPLAN process, which is called the Illinois Project for Local Assessment of Needs. It consists of a community health assessment, and we'll talk about what that entails. A planning process is done every 5 years, and talk a little bit about it. It's required for certification. Very similar process is done by hospitals. They do theirs every 3 years as part of the charitable hospital organization. So any not-for-profit hospital often does what's called a community health assessment. They have to, because they're supposed to identify where they're going to reinvest back into communities. So as we work through this, it becomes very important to align those two processes. So our 3 major hospital systems in our area and the health department and anyone else who's doing this, is that we are pulling our resources together. So ideally that we are putting a reinvestment back into those items that our community has said are the most important to them. So part of that structure was we brought together the Community Health Collaborative, right? So I'm going to come back to the slide previous, I think, is probably the next one.
Next one's the list.
Okay, the list of organizations, and we'll go back. So when we started this process this time around, I said, we've got to get all on the same page. These are all organizations in our community that do some kind of health planning. And you've probably seen their documents and similar kinds of materials that are put out. So we include the Boone County Health Department, recognizing we're going to try and take a more regional approach to this. I mean, as we know, we really don't have boundaries. Mercy Health, OSF Healthcare, the Region 1 Planning Council, the Rockford Regional Health Council, Swedish American, Transform Rockford, United Way of Rock River Valley, University of Illinois College of Medicine also does a planning process, and the Winnebago County Health Department. So about 2 years ago, we pulled this group together and said we all are in a planning process. How can we bring all of our resources together so that we have one planning scenario where we go through and we come up with similar issues? Now, we may all work at them from different strategies, but the idea being that, well, we talk the same language and we can then identify what we're going to prioritize. So that if you were to ask, one county, is it, high blood pressure, diabetes, or, is it violence, right? Which ones are pointing out which, and that we have our list for our region so that people, when we communicate with them, are all on the same page about the health issues that we're going to be addressing. Now, when you see the stars, obviously, there were some backbone organizations, both the Rockford Regional Health Council and the Winnebago County Health Department became the backbone. And it's very specific language that's related to using what's called a particular framework, so that we are consensus decision-making, how we support each other and coming back. So, and then in the back, sorry about that, slide down whatever it is. So part of all, we had to put together, as you would guess, all of our mission, vision, and values. So this is just an oversight. We'll provide that to you, and you can have a copy of this. But I think the important thing is to improve the health and well-being of our communities through collaboration, innovation, and promotion of data-driven, evidence-based practices. And that Boone and Winnebago counties are healthy, thriving, diverse, and safe communities in which the physical, mental, social, and spiritual well-being of its members is supported and celebrated. So there's a lot of efforts that all of our organizations fall into that. So some of our core values, accountability, so you can hear more about this. Advocacy, maybe we're going to advocate for those health improvement areas differently. Collaborative, compassion, expertise, healing, health equity, innovative, outcome-informed, transformative, and trauma-informed. So those became our core values. So I'm going to maybe skip forward to more. So then I'm going to turn it over to Peter, who's going to talk a little bit now about the framework, what assessments were done, some of our key data that we found from the surveys and various assessments, and then what became the strategic issues. And then we're going to put you through the exercise.
I'll take your work. Thank you very much. So the MAP framework is a framework that health departments use when they're doing the IPLAN process. And it's very structured. It kind of lays out how to look at your communities, to assess the needs, to build collaboration. And so this little model to the side, organization, partnership, development, visioning. So we talk about forming the collaborative, creating a vision and mission statement, all those things. Those are sort of the backbone to bring people together so they have a common language and way to work together. There's 4 core assessments or tools that are used to look at the health needs very broadly in a variety of different ways. The community health status assessment is a very sort of data specific tool that really tries to pull the data from all the sources. One of the challenges with data, of course, is it's always lagging. So while we look at things like poverty rates or population growth or the socioeconomic status or the health status of different communities, some of that data, as we pull from common public sources, that data is maybe a couple of years old, but it's still, we can see trends, we can identify things, and it's really sort of part of the collaborative. We talk about being data-driven, evidence-driven, trying to get to a common set of data points to be able to talk about where are we and where are we trying to get to, so that all these different organizations can speak with a more common language about things. And that was one of the things we're trying to accomplish. The forces of change assessment is more like, if you think about focus groups, they're qualitative exercises. We came to the board 2019 to do an exercise where we looked at a variety of themes and ideas and sort of got your input. Those were done also with community groups with various agencies throughout the counties, and that gave us a lot more sort of flavor of issues as people perceive them. Community themes and strengths was really a consumer survey. The Regional Health Council took the lead on this one. They, working with R1 Regional Planning, put together a survey that we all put it together, but they were the lead agency on that particular piece. That was going out through the schools to get input from schools and school families, through the Rockford Housing Authority, through a lot of stakeholder agencies that had participated in other assessments. And that was really trying to get even more deeply into people's perceptions of their accessibility to healthcare, what the concerns were, what the barriers were. And we pulled information from that. And then the local public health assessment is a tool that's used by health departments really to say, how well do all the agencies within your community work together to help address the core functions of what public health are. And so that's again another thing. So we pulled agencies together for full day of work at Clem to talk through that and go through those exercises. So each of these assessments sort of gives us a different body of information to work with. Next slide. As Dr. Martell said, this started in 2019. The collaborative was formed. We did the mission statement, the visioning, and all that earlier in 2019, and then starting in the third quarter, really through the early part of 2020, is when those 4 assessments were worked on and pulled together. COVID definitely had an impact on our ability to complete those things and to bring people together to talk about them. But we continued to take those findings, and for the rest of 2020, we really looked to working with that steering group of the collaborative to identify how would you group all that information. You now have 4 assessments that have all this different pieces of information. What comes out of that is themes or ideas that you can sort of try to cluster into groups. And so we'll share with you what those 7 overarching groups were. These are in no particular rank order, but these were the 7 strategic issues that were identified. And I'm going to walk through each of them and give you a little bit of what the data is that was used to support those. So the first one is disinvested. Next slide. Thank you. So probably most of this information won't be too shocking to too many of you, unfortunately. What we see is that looking at Winnebago County, we see, and for the most part, we're comparing to the state of Illinois. Sometimes we compare with national data. We just picked some of the highlights for each of these categories. I'm trying not to bury you completely in data tonight. We see a poverty rate that's higher. We see food deserts, food insecurity.
Mr. Chairman,
exposure.
Mr. Chairman, can I interrupt the meeting? The slides that are being shown have not moved. So there's something wrong with the slide presentation for those members attending via Zoom.
Thank you for notifying us of that.
Yeah.
Well, Ian's checking into this. First of all, when he talks about these 4 assessments, all of those will be annotated and you can look through all the data points that were collected. These are some high-level data points. University of Illinois College of Medicine was the lead on what we call the health status assessment. That's looking at all of the common survey data. You hear about the census data. You hear about some of the CDC common data sets. They looked at that with us. We had the survey that goes out to the individuals. Some of you may have actually received that survey in the mail in your homes, or maybe some of your constituents may have called you about receiving that survey. So it went out not only in what we call backpacks of the school children, at that time the electronic backpacks, but also was mailed to people's homes for survey results. Forces have changed for those board members. You remember we were talking about future. You were saying, you got your crystal balls out and said, what's the county going to look like in 5 years? None of you predicted some of these things. I mean, none of us did. But again, what did you see coming down the pipe? What did you see happening? We went through that. And then again, this kind of local public health system assessment is something where these entities come together and basically say, how are we doing on this? So there's going to be all those that data, but this is really kind of a high level discussion. So I mean, there are probably 1,000 data points if you wanted to look at disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods, but this is what the group pulled out as kind of being the most impactful. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I have a question about that slide before you move on. What is like a food insecurity rate and an eviction rate? What are those? What do those mean?
So food insecurity, there's questionnaires that come through asking how often in the last month, for example, or have you, there's a variety of questions that get grouped together under food insecurity. Did you have enough food for your family? Did you, or how often did you?
Food pantries. There's standard data measurements for that, Mr. Renas. So for instance, there might be a question on, and even in the WIC program, they will ask in the last month, have you had to supplement with anything outside? Have you not been able to have enough food for the month? So again, some of them will be much more, they gauge individuals' response. How many times did you access a food pantry in the last 30 days? It also looks at food insecurity rate, looks at your enrollment in SNAP and some of those other supportive benefit programs.
So it's saying 18% of the population of Winnebago County.
Reported that they had some level of food insecurity within their family within the period of time that was surveyed.
For families with children.
And the eviction rate means 3.81% of the people in Winnebago County have been evicted.
There is a calculated rate. If you go to the eviction site, they use a standard definition about eviction. And so again, from the state calculation versus our local county comparison. So we are known as a county with a high eviction rate.
Right, but that stat in particular, is something I focused on in my activities outside of the board. And speaking with Tom Klein, there was questions about how it's evaluated and its accuracy. So I'm just curious how that was put together. Maybe we could talk
I'd be
about
happy to
it
follow
another
up
time.
with more information about the methodology.
And, there's going to be, when you open up the book, you'll find out all where the data sources, how they're calculated. But I think come back to, and I come back to Mr. Arnett, you may not think that that's the most valid tool. As a nurse, I would go out and weigh babies on a baby scale, right? And I would drag that scale in the back of my car, right? You could take it upstairs, and it's not a calibrated scale. What you're looking at is relative change. And so this is the agreed upon measurement that they're using throughout the nation for eviction rate. And so they use a standard national definition so we compare. It's not, in terms of this is the best method, it's really comparing it to others as well. So this gives us an idea about what our neighborhoods are like. We could have also looked at, as we know, blight. We know how many properties in our county are condemned. We know that. We could also do some, some data regarding that as well.
I believe that also includes, because I attended a workshop on this a couple of years ago. The state was here looking at the evictions. And one of the things they also looked at was the Winnebago Housing Authority and Rockford Housing Authority. They included those evictions with all the evictions. So it wasn't just someone who has an apartment or a house that's renting it out. It had to be the whole cycle of renters, no matter where they were from. Does that help you at all?
Oh,
And
no.
we were high then too, because of all the evictions that went through Rockford Housing Authority and Winnebago County Housing Authority.
Well,
Okay.
thank you.
But remember, this is just one data set. Our community also said disinvested vulnerable neighborhoods, whether they called it, they might have said, I don't feel safe, or I don't feel like I have, my housing stable. Again, remember, it's a compilation of different assessment points.
And to that point,
I have
sort
a
of coming up
question.
with these themes.
I have a question.
Oh, sure, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Now that we know we have neighborhoods that are in need and we've done the measures, what are we going to do about it?
We haven't gotten anything through that point. We're gonna, first of all, we're gonna go through some data points on each of those 7. And then we've got to go back to what we said 3 years ago was our issue and where we're at. And if they're still showing up, and then how do we frame that? And then what can we do?
Similarly, for maternity and early child care, this is just pulling a couple slides on this, pulling some of the data points that were found. Rates, low birth rate, very low birth rate. The fact that births with Black mothers are 2 times the rate for white mothers. Again, exposure to lead. That teen births overall are declining, but they decline more rapidly across the state than they have here for Winnebago County. Another slide on the screen. Child abuse, as reported through the state, are higher here. Mortality rates of under 18-year-old black children is double that for white children, and that the C-section rate is higher here at the Winnebago County hospitals than overall for other comparable hospitals across the state. So again, indicating that these are just some of the data points that we're highlighting that support this as being one of the critical strategic issues that was identified across all these surveys. The third one is mental health system capacity. And first is that there's a lack or a shortage of providers to provide services. The use of the emergency rooms for reported mental health problems is higher here. We did a consumer survey and asked people about barriers to care. Some of the things that they identified relative to mental health address affordability, lack of insurance, wait times for appointments, which may relate to the provider shortages, and the overall lack of providers.
Excuse me,
Yes.
I have a question. Is that okay? Sure. When was the survey, maybe you mentioned a little bit earlier, when was the survey done? What was the time frame again?
So the community themes and strengths survey went out into the field early 2020 and was out in the field for a couple of months. And the problem was just as COVID, so it went out in January, I believe. In February, we started getting reports. In March, everything shut down. So that survey was out. There were pop-ups that were done in the community, trying to get people to answer the survey. It was pushed out in the mail, it was pushed out by email, but it was right. And so
It was prior to COVID is when this
it was prior to COVID,
Just prior, then
Yes.
everything sort of fell to the wayside.
like that.
So we don't know really, how much percentage came back or how much could have come back because COVID came in and everything.
And I don't have the response rates here with me
Okay.
specifically tonight, but we know that the response rate to this was impacted by COVID, particularly for the schools, because the schools went to remote. And so whereas those kids were supposed to bring them back in their backpacks and bring in surveys, some of those didn't come back in. But then we electronically reached out and did think other ways to try to get those surveys in. And all of the data, yeah, this was all collected pre-COVID. So to some extent, to the extent that COVID impacted things or changed anything in people's perceptions or in the data, that isn't reflected in what we had to date in our hands.
I also want to say, we're focusing on problems, so I mean, I think that's the other thing. I mean, I think this is a really hard thing to hear, right? Because we're focused on all negatives, because the idea is that we're going to identify the priorities for improvement. So we're not going to, you're going to see what are the negatives more than you're not going to see positives in this kind of assessment piece displaying the data. So I want to be clear that there may have been some things that people say this is a great place to live, right? I mean, but that's not what this is about. This is about identifying priorities for improvement.
And definitely there were places where there was improvement, where people liked their neighborhoods, they felt safe and things like that. This is the nature of my job. Throughout COVID, I've been the one reporting how many cases did we have, giving all those bad news reports. You have to stand in front of everyone and give them. So it's the same thing here. Yes, sir.
Quick question. Do you have a slide that'll compare the last survey to this survey versus state numbers? Is Winnebago County as a whole improving, or some issues you speak to, it's gotten better, but
I don't have a slide this evening.
is there data points reflecting that? Because it seems like to me that would be a little better way to say how you have to get all your points. I understand what you're doing, but is Winnebago getting better or worse? In what areas is it improving? In which areas is it getting worse? That's what I'd like to see.
And the report, the actual IPLAN report, will get at that.
Okay.
More, because that'll talk about where.
Thank you.
How things balance out.
Yep.
But since the focus is always on improvement, there is a tendency to say, we're doing better here. No, let's focus over here because we can do better. There's more opportunity for improvement. But to your point, yes, that will be part of the overall IPLAN. We'll give a better sense of that balance.
Thank you.
Similarly, suicide rates, retention are high, again, reported higher here than in overall in the state. Next slide, please. Violence, crime, and public safety, again, a variety of different surveys. Again, the focus groups, those community focus groups, people would talk about that, and they would talk about what was good and what was bad. The surveys that went out to individual homes and to students, ask questions about how safe you feel, or about your neighborhood, you feel safe riding your bicycle, different things like that. And certainly some of that was, there were plenty of people who said it was good. These are some of the indicators of where we're sort of, again, a little bit of an outlier, or where it's concerned: crime index, homicide rate, overdose rates, firearm mortality rates. And in some cases, we're off by a little bit from the state. In some cases, we're off by a lot more. And we also collected data to look at Boone County as well, because they're part of this overall assessment. But for our purposes, we also pull in Boone County data. Next slide. Specific morbidities was sort of a way to group things like cancer rates, things like mortality and morbidity, illness and death, whether it's premature overall for the population of Winnebago County. So the mortality rate, it's a higher death rate for the African American community. Again, it's higher still. Certain cancers are higher here. Many of the cancers are higher here. And respiratory disease. Well, anything associated with COPD or lung diseases. Again, we're an outlier in those areas. And so we didn't want to lose sight of that, even though it's not so much a strategic thing, that those indicators are out there that show that Winnebago County overall's health is not where one might hope it would be. Next slide, please. Similarly, tobacco use, asthma, and ER visits, particularly within Rockford, are higher as well. Education and employment. So, on one hand, we're talking about disinvested neighborhoods. Another way of looking at some of these issues, and they do cross each other, and so trying to tease them out to talk about them as themes was a little bit challenging, but we sort of grouped these looking at, again, comparing how people self-report. That goes back to those surveys that we did. How do you report your own health relative to educational levels, relative to income levels, looking at graduation rates, both from high school, and then looking at achievement for bachelor's degrees, and looking for where those disparities are, or as we look at social determinants of health and look at health equity issues, where does that appear in the data? Because that certainly then gives us indicators of things that we want to be looking at for moving towards solutions. Next slide. The last one is health literacy and trust. I think that's the seven. And this really gets at the question of people's, do you understand, when you get medical information, do you understand what you're being told? Do you trust what you're being told? Do you know how to get the information you want? Where do you get information? So that whole area, because I always want someone to go with me to the doctor's office, because I can only listen so much if it's about me. I need somebody else to objectively listen. Well, that's an accessibility issue. It's also a luxury that I have as someone who has the ability to bring someone with me who might also help me understand. But for a lot of people, that's not necessarily an option. So the whole issue around health literacy and trust of how do you want people to be better informed to do better and to take better care of themselves when they can, if they can't access the information, if they don't believe the information, if they don't, and in particular, what came up in our focus groups with social media is how do you know what to trust in terms of health information, because COVID has been its own unique example of that. And so again, our survey showed that we saw among Black and Hispanic respondents, they reported a higher rate of, it was difficult for them to access medical information they wanted. It was challenging to, I'm not sure I understand what I get because it's coming into me as jargon or it's not in language that I'm comfortable with and I understand. Where I don't necessarily really believe what I'm being told. I'm not sure who to trust. And so those have real implications for a health department because you have to, how do we communicate with those people that we're most focused on survey or who need our programs the most? How do we make sure that we're communicating with them in a way, and certainly for other providers as well?
Sure, just a comment I'll make, if I may, because I know even when I was a little kid growing up, smoking was bad. Drinking too much booze is bad. Everything I know was bad. I didn't have to have anybody tell me that. I mean, it's out there. It's all out there. It's still out there. So I find it, I guess, a question at times, trusting medical information, which I understand that. But we all know what's good and what's bad and what could harm you for the most part, especially when you're growing up as a kid. Who's teaching you this? Who's showing you this? So I knew from an early start, me being a lifetime asthmatic, probably, back in the later part of the 60s, I was probably a test patient, which I know all of this stuff, that I knew smoking was bad. I stayed away from cigarettes. I stayed away from this, and I learned what's good and what's bad. It's like eating a hamburger. That's fantastic. We all know. I love my burgers. I love this and that, but I also know, I guess I can just do common sense and learn, it could lead to obesity. It could lead to a number of issues, including heart issues, you name it. So, and we're all different. Some people can handle things better than I can and vice versa. So I think in some cases, I think it goes on the responsibility of the individual to say, hey, I know I'm doing something that's totally wrong. I shouldn't be doing this and so forth. Am I making sense or just making a comment?
You're making sense. I'm not commenting, you're done.
Thank you. Thank you. So we all know this. So it's just the point of, I know I don't need any other TV commercial, radio commercial, somebody telling me smoking's bad. I know that. I knew that 50 plus years ago. So anyhow.
I just wanted to say that some of you might know and you might not. Black man does not trust the system. Do you know why? Because of that Tuskegee incident. They were injected with the syphilis or whatever, and they were given that. A lot of them don't trust. And it's hard to get the Black man to go to the doctor.
And this has been, I think, the
That's
fight
true.
we've had right now for the vaccine, is the mistrust of the government in producing a vaccine. And it's a challenge, it's a lift. And, we've had, I cannot tell you how many events we have and how many incentives. And the general consensus was, this is a vaccine, it should protect you, but there's a lot of distrust. And this is a recent example. Now, there are other examples we can go back on, but, they talk about implicit bias in healthcare. How do we train our providers to be better communicators? Oftentimes, nowadays, and we used to be, we give out pamphlets, very few clients read pamphlets anymore. We call litter with literature. It's on the floor of our clinics and every place else. They want social media, they want first, but then look at all the social media, and that people, the bots and everything else that we generate information. So this is a challenge for all of us, right? No matter who you are, whether you're the elected official, you want them to understand an issue that you're going to address and you're going to vote on it. You want them to get factual information. But you know that the chat rooms are out there. You know that there's all that background. It isn't necessarily validated or verified.
And information is out there. You're doing a fantastic job. I think all of the organizations are doing a fantastic job. It still comes down to personal responsibility in a number of cases. Not all cases, just a number of cases. Oh, yeah.
I don't want to make the meeting longer, but your comment that you just made it's just advantage that you have from being able to know things, because the people that they're talking about, they don't know this stuff. I mean, you say it's common sense and you argue it, but there's a lot of people in our community that just don't know. And, a lot, that, you know, it all accumulates together with the dropout rate, not able to get, proper education. It's a lot of people in this community that just don't know, and just because you know it don't mean those people know. I don't know, I take a prime example, my in-laws, working class, did everything, they didn't have the highest education, I got married. I started cooking vegetables, giving my wife vitamins. My mother-in-law thought I was gonna kill my wife. I was trying to kill my wife because I was giving her vitamins and vegetables.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, and she was serious. But, you know, if you don't know, you don't know. And you can't assume that everybody in this community knows those things that you know.
Right, well, Mr. Neighbors, and that's right, that's why information needs to get out. Yet at the same time, your pack of cigarettes tells your warning, Surgeon General, so it's there. And there is proof out there, and there is things out there. People
But that warning label doesn't
But
mean that
information,
you can't read.
but information still needs to be out there. It always has to be out there. It always has to be promoted all the time.
We know it's out there. I mean, I spoke for 40 years.
Yeah.
And I've been off of them for 20-some years, but I knew better, but I did it anyway.
Sure.
So we're all different. And then the other thing is people have to be able to read the package. Because so many people can't read the package, because first of all, it's not even in their language. And we can't have all the languages on that little pack of cigarettes. So it comes down to, and we also have a big problem that we don't have enough interpreters for people to understand, even when they go to a doctor or they go to a dentist or whatever, because it's very difficult. Even the person they bring with them many times is a child. And that child can only explain so much in the language to their parent. So they're the interpreters. And I've seen this over and over many times in the industry I worked in, that it was, first of all, I had to realize I had to look at the man or whoever was paying for the house and listen to the child to do the interpretation. So that becomes a problem too, because there's even though they bring a child with them, what the doctor or the nurse or whoever is telling them, that child doesn't always understand when it's related into a different language. So there's a lot of barriers out there that many of us aren't truly aware of, because it doesn't affect us in our everyday life. So until it affects us in our everyday life, we just don't really get it.
I'm gonna ask a question. When you go to Walgreens or CVS or, Walmart to get your drugs, how many of you read the drug information sheet that's attached to the staple, the multi-plate?
Yeah, I do.
And do you read?
Oh, you do?
Right, and do you understand everything that's in that? Do you know what the percentages that are reported? Side effects or-
And that scares me so much, I don't want to take
See, a lot of
it.
people, and again, numerous people talk about inability to read numbers or understand the concept of numbers is a very common issue that we see as well. So by going 1 versus 10, what does that mean? Is, is more better than, less? I mean, these are the concepts that, remember, this is what the community is really responding back to and saying, a lot of times I don't understand the information I'm being provided. I think most of us, if we read everything on that drug information pamphlet, many of us choose not to take our drugs.
As I mentioned, I'm a lifetime asthmatic, so I know what I can and cannot do, and I learned what I cannot do. And yet I read things, I inform myself, I go out there and do it. It is a simple thing if you want to learn it. And if there's somebody out there, that's why your department is ever so key, Dr. Martell. If any department in there, continue education, show people what they need to know. Put it, if you need to put in a different languages, that's all fine, but you have to learn it. And again, it does come, I think, with some personal responsibility that if you fall down, you pick yourself back up and say, oops. And I know some of my friends, they were with drugs, they learned it was bad, they're off, they went back, and then they finally realized it. So it's, again, your department, and I guess for the state and so forth. Continuing education is key. You have to get the message out over and over again.
But I think we trusted our doctors to tell us the right information. This drug is good for you. You need to take it. You need to take it twice a day. I think there's that part, kind of comes into play when you have, really the kind of misrepresentation of, disadvantaged populations, things like this that we have to really account for. We have to be mindful if they reside in our county is really the point. position where they don't trust the information provided by another topic.
Exactly.
So I guess I'm not understanding in context of the conversation we're having here about language being a barrier, the relationship with race, with people understanding their medical information. You know, Hispanics have the best understanding. With blacks having the least, it just doesn't make sense. What does race have to do with the ability to understand if language isn't the barrier? You know what I mean?
Understand.
Well, it may be, it may or may, I mean, don't. The question that was asked was, do you have trouble, or how often do you have trouble understanding medical information given? And there was an overall response rate. I don't remember what it was. It was some average of those numbers. And then, as on most questions, we then went back and looked to see, was there a difference in response level or rate in the type of response by race or ethnicity? Just as one way to look. Again, we're trying to identify, are there disparities among communities on anywhere we can to try to identify those. And so this is how those 1,000+ respondents answered this question. So I wouldn't assume that sometimes it may be a translation issue, but it might also be how it's written and how it's presented. Reading those, the drug information sheets, those aren't easy, even for people who are, who read a lot and who are more educated and have a larger vocabulary. People with more limited vocabulary, you might be able to read it, but you may not understand what it really is telling you. And when it talks about relative risk, you may not quite know what to do with that. It gets at issues of innumeracy, it gets at issues of how comfortable you are understanding what you're given to read. I can read, I can read something phonetically, doesn't mean I necessarily understand it. I can't read physics and read those formulas. I can read what the formula says, but I don't know what that's telling me.
15-letter words.
I wouldn't understand it. I can read it, I just don't understand it. So I think the overall issue is we do see that a portion of the population, I guess I'm a little, the third bullet, which is about not trusting, is also highly problematic. I mean, one is, do I know where to seek information? Do I know how to get information? Do I understand the information I'm reading? Do I believe the information? Those are each different aspects, and they sort of can send you up in different directions of thinking about what the issue is. And so we'll talk about each of these relative to each other in terms of their importance. So if there's no more questions here, let's move on to the next slide, please.
Can I just make one comment about this?
Sure.
About this, whether you can read it, or whether you can understand it, whatever. On all medications that I could possibly think of, in all the commercials you see on television, they say, if you're asthmatic, warning, this may raise your blood pressure. You know, and then every one of them that always has their boilerplate statement there. If you need information to understand this, contact your medical provider. And so, you know, there's help there if you don't understand what you're reading on that bottle of meds. Make a phone call.
Quality Congress, you call Walgreens or CVS, say, hey, there's acetaminophen mixed with some other type of drug. Is there an issue? And he or she will say, well, yeah, there might be, or call your doctor or whatever the case is. So again, I'm more personal responsibility person. That's the.
Exactly. And every med that you get, if you get a script and you go pick it up, they ask you, do you understand this? Do you want the pharmacist to explain this to you or whatever? They ask you that. People are reaching out every which way they can to help you understand. The warnings are written and the verbals are there on every one of these television ads, the myriad of drugs that are out there.
just to say, the data points are showing that that's not the experience of everyone. And that we as a group should trust the experiences and of other people, trust that other people are experts in their own experiences, even if those experiences are inconsistent with our own. So I understand that most people in this room have access to medical information, they trust the medical information, and that they understand that medical information. But these data points are telling us that that is not a consistent experience across our community.
Right,
So-
we don't know the exact 100% data on what came back because due to COVID and what kind of response they could have come back. So this is what, I guess, the health department sadly has to work with, so this is what you did
Right.
to see back.
But these results are consistent with national respondents outside of COVID situations. So these are real numbers. These are numbers that I'm familiar with. These are numbers that we work with all the time. So there may be a small margin of error or differentiations because of COVID, but this is a trend. This is real. What Dorothy spoke to, that's real. What Tim spoke to, that's real.
Okay, guys. You just have to recognize that there's gonna be disparity. There is no perfect world, and there's gonna be imperfection. So if we're looking for a perfect world and you can pick up the phone and call anybody you want, you're not dealing with a whole deck of cards. I'm sorry. There are people that have absolute real needs that don't trust the medical profession. And those needs in their mind's eye, I don't care about yours, their mind's eye are real. And that's what is left out of this equation. As Angela said, that's a real number. Whether you want to agree with it or blame them for not picking up a phone, I don't even want to hear that. There has to be an element of human compassion and the willingness to reach out to people that are less fortunate than me in order to enable them to develop that trust with the medical profession. So I'd like to move on. Thank you.
So, that was a very quick overview of those 7 broad categories of sort of, and the data that's underpinning them. And as a few of you did observe, the data is what the data is. And for any given data point, you can always argue a given data point, but there's a theme here. There's a sort of an ongoing thing that comes through from those 4 assessments, pulling out what we did with that through the collaborative. So, as Dr. Martell said, we do an IPLAN every 5 years. When we last submitted to the state was 2016, and the 3 areas that were identified in 2016 as the priorities for Winnebago County were maternal and child health, violence, and mental behavioral health. Well, those 3 are still identified among the 7 critical issues that came out from all the assessments. So there may have been some progress on any of those, but not enough that they still didn't rise to the level of still being priority areas. And one of the things that we did find was that sort of tied all 3 of those priority areas together in a variety of ways was the issue of trauma. And so there's been a tremendous amount of work done over the last few years around trauma, becoming trauma informed, around education, and that work continued throughout COVID. That training and education and outreach did not stop. But so coming out, our last IPLAN really had this kind of a focus. These 3 areas and that. So what we're really here to do tonight is to talk about these 7 strategic issues that were identified through doing these 4 assessments over the last couple of years. 3 of those move directly over, they're the same as our prior priorities. So they really remain the priorities for the health department as we look at the IPLAN and as we work with our partner organizations. So part of what we're going to talk about next will be how do we sort of weave those other areas, disinvested neighborhoods, morbidities, education, health literacy, and trust into these and see sort of what you see as the priorities of how you would rank those. Next slide, please. So we have a short video. It is 8 minutes long. And it will explain the exercise that we're going to do. So I beg your indulgence. Hopefully it'll load and we can watch it.
We used to say AV, right?
Sometimes you see this, and that's why we have to go out and go back.
Embedded, so it shouldn't be a problem. If you want to have it again.
No cigar tonight? No cigar tonight?
Oh, yeah. After the meeting.
I know. I have a flat screen like that too without a sample. I can't hear anything.
Oh,
Do you need the video to move
Yeah, sample.
before you move on?
People want to say something, it's all- And I don't know anything about what it counts. I can't. I don't hear sound. He's got it all the way up.
Mr. Thompson, can you hear the video?
No.
No,
Right, lost Mr.
no.
Okay, thank you. They cannot hear it either.
You can help me out with explaining it.
All right, we're gonna move on to without the video.
We're gonna go on to the next one.
Just gonna jump to that slide. After that, the next slide. The exercise, what the video would have shown you. And it shouldn't take me 8 minutes to explain it. I'll get myself in more trouble with it. What we're gonna do is, for each of the 3 priority areas that are in the IPLAN already, maternal and child health, violence, and mental health, we're gonna look at the other four strategy groups and sort of look at how important you think they would be relative to each other. And so, this is a little bit long to try to explain, but so if you think about the impact of divested and vulnerable neighborhoods, you'll see it's the same list going across the top and down the side. The idea is to say, if you were to compare morbidities, which is things like cancer rates, early death, things like that, how much of an impact would that have on mental health and child health care as compared to its impact, the impact of working on disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods? Similar, I'll try and walk through it, and then you can ask questions. Dr. Martell can fill in where I'm. The idea is to say, of these four areas, neighborhoods, morbidities, education, and health literacy, which of these would have the greatest impact compared to any of the others on maternal and child health? So if we were to prioritize, where do we think working on education and employment would have a bigger impact on maternal and child health than working on health literacy and trust? We're going to sort of a paired comparison. We're going to walk through each of these, and then we score them. So as a group, we're going to need to come to some level of consensus to say, is something a lot more important? Is this one a lot more important than that? A little more important? A little less important? A lot less important? If we can go through this exercise, so there's three of these. We have maternal and child health, we have violence, and we have mental health. We're going to look at each of those other four areas compared to each other, and how we think, how you see them impacting the big issue. We'll assign a score, and when we come to consensus of how important it is compared to each other, it calculates a score in relative ranking. That'll help us.
I had heard Peter describe this. How many of you understood that? Okay.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
got a couple.
So let me,
Now you can
you can
translate.
see how difficult it is, right, for anybody, right? So for instance, if you were to say, we're going to take a look at, as an impact of maternal child health, the first thing we're going to rank is disinvested vulnerable neighborhoods. So think about food security, think about housing, think about some of the other, like neighborhoods. Do you think that or specific mortality has more impact on maternal and child health? And there's no right answer. It's just your answer and your assessment. So, and again, the scoring is 10 is a lot more important, 5 a little more important, 1 they're equal, right? You think they're both going to have an influence. And don't worry about the 1/5 and 1/10 because that's a
Part of the formula.
It's part of the formula. So you can enter as a all right.
So I was supposed to write this down on this.
No,
we're going to talk about it.
We're going to talk about it.
It would be easier if we had, each of us had a sheet, I think, to look at. It's sort of hard for me to see. Like, maybe I'm the only one. Can you guys see that?
Yeah. If we have a copy, I'm sure we can make a copy. We can get everyone to have a paper copy.
What's the phone?
All right.
Okay.
So we were thinking about maternal and child health. So we talk about high mortality. We're talking about maternal death. We're talking about childhood death early. We're talking about poor health outcomes. Do we think specific morbidities have a greater impact than a disinvested vulnerable neighborhood?
No.
No, it's a
Less
lot.
impact.
Yeah, I would say a lot less important.
Specific morbidities means rate of cancer and specific
Could be
disease.
cancer, could be, underlying health conditions, asthma, diabetes.
No, I would say.
I would say
Education, health literacy.
not invested at neighborhood is disinvested, some of the pipes still have lead in those neighborhoods. Some of the sidewalks aren't taken care of, so children aren't riding their bikes down the street. So you have,
I think that's what we were saying.
That's what I agree with that. The rate of cancer isn't affecting it. It's what Tim just said.
So it's the neighborhood that's
Yeah.
affecting it, not the specific morbidity.
If you go back to Matthew, baseline is preservation, self-preservation and shelter. So if that's a basic need, and if the guy's right, I think it is, then divesting and vulnerable neighborhoods to me should be a priority.
So do we think it's a 10, a lot more important?
I'll give it a 7.5.
Yeah.
It's
10 or 5?
I would give it a 10.
So
What did she say? I didn't hear her.
We're ranking divested in,
7.5.
No, what, 7.5 on what, which one?
Divesting in vulnerable neighborhoods. I would put maybe, 5's too little, so I'm gonna put a 10.
It's more important than the
I think
others.
it's the other way around, like they said. So it's how we're reading the chart is confusing.
So,
It's
Without the-
divested in
Translate
vulnerable
it.
neighborhood against specific mortalities. And what I heard you say, it's more important. What you're now telling me, is it a 10 or a 5?
that
Right.
neighborhoods is a bigger issue than the morbidity issue for
Yeah.
maternal child.
We'll just go around the room and get everyone's pick.
I don't understand the graph now.
Then we lost Tim on the grid part, the primary one with the comparing against, yeah.
Say it again.
I guess.
Say the first name, sorry. Okay.
So-
You can say it one more time and go around, I think, then we can give you.
So as me and Tim just discussed too, so the primary one you're going off of as the one that we're comparing off of is the one from the left down, right? So don't pay attention to the fact that the top line is green. Okay, that is not the main line. The main line that we're comparing is disinvested more important than specific morbidities? And then it's gonna go down the line to education, employment, you know what I'm saying, like that. So disinvested is the only one we're focusing on right now. That's our primary one they're comparing.
We're gonna compare, so the first step is to compare disinvested to specific morbidities. Then we'll say disinvested to education and employment, disinvested to health literacy and trust.
We're going left to right.
Right?
Yeah.
So another health literacy point, see, another description helped.
There was no description on the chart.
So,
Just private agree.
Well, actually, that's what confused me and him.
All right,
so if disinvested is, I think I heard a consensus that it's more important than specific morbidities. So is it a 5 or a 10?
so maybe just, we'll go around and put your fingers up, 5 or 10.
5?
10,
It's more than,
right? You don't get to say more than.
no,
5 or 10, disinvested
it's more important than.
and or 50s.
It's, less important.
Okay, you're a 5. 10, 10.
I don't know. You lost me on this one.
We're not asking the experts, we're just asking what you think is more important. We just, like we sent out surveys to the community.
And there's no right or wrong.
There's no right or wrong. Sure.
I'm saying it's subjective. When you have a mother that has cancer, pregnant mother,
Okay.
then that would be 10, but then it could drop to 5. Depends on who's looking at it.
Okay. We're really between 5 and 10. So far, we got 3 10s, not sure, and a 5. All right.
Again, I think I agree with it. It's all circumstantial. It's circumstantial.
it's a 10.
5,
Little more.
Mr. Booker?
10.
10.
I'll do a 5 million because I don't think I'm well enough informed right now.
Okay.
10.
5.
I would go with 7.5, but I would go with 5. I'm actually.
Stop being the
Five.
So we're gonna look at 5, and we're gonna say,
You didn't know.
we're We're gonna show you how this works. Okay. We got 5 minutes. Well, there you go, Ian. There we go. All right.
Same thing now. The impact on maternal and child health of disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods as compared to education and employment.
So what do you think is the greater influence on the impact of maternal child health?
You guys are equal to one, I mean, but
Right.
wherever.
Start over there. We're gonna start over here. Thank you.
Kevin, you're up.
Yeah, no, so we're talking about specific.
We're talking about neighborhoods, it's still on the top row.
Oh, okay, so education and employment.
Right. So you think education and employment are more important than disinvested neighborhoods on maternal and child health outcomes?
Boy, you bounce back to one another, you need both. So I'll go with 5.
So it's a little more important, a disinvested neighborhood over education and employment. You're saying equal, then it's a 1.
And if you think they're equal, I mean, one is.
There is 1.
Because one plays off the other, so I think at this point I'll go with 1.
Okay. 10.
I would have to go with 9.
Ten.
I'm sorry, because you have to live in those neighborhoods to understand what's in those neighborhoods.
No,
I understand, but.
Hey, did she say there's only 10 or 5?
10.
Nine's not on the,
Then I
nine's
would
not on.
ask, because that education and employment
All right.
is so important to those neighborhoods.
It ties into one another, that's what I'm saying.
Okay,
Yeah.
so are you
So-
saying
so-
1? They're equal. It's just as important. to
One
have-
isn't equal,
Yes.
Yeah.
then I'll go with a 1.
Mr. Reno.
110.
Okay.
So saying that education is far more important than
No. It's disinvested neighborhood as compared to education and employment.
Right, education and employment, in my opinion, is far more important than the disinvested
Okay.
neighborhood.
She just wants to keep it on the rating up until just 1, I think that's what she
So
was
that's-
saying. But yeah, I get what, I'm the same way.
That's a 110, yeah.
110.
It's a 110.
Okay, that's what I want.
No, we'll show you the reciprocal. In fact,
I'll do that too.
Under, here, we'll show you the reciprocal. Under specific morbidities, I want you to put a 1/5. All right. So far we have a 1, a 10, a 1, a 110. So that's. Okay. Mr. Lindmer?
I think education is a lot more important than the 110.
No, it's, as compared to disinvestment, it's a 110, so you think it's less important. So we got 2 more 110, a lot less important. Mr. Batita?
5.
A 5?
One.
A 1?
Does disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods include access to healthcare?
No.
No. Okay, then 1/5.
1/5, 110,
110.
110, 1/5, 110,
110.
110,
We're on a roll.
1. All right. Yes, okay. When's that? So like 110 was the, again,
The most common.
most common response, so.
I'll give it a 1.
Okay.
It's really hard.
No, I know where they would go.
Delivery hospital on the west side anymore.
All right.
Yeah, there is just like.
So that's why I asked if it was part of.
What's the order for this one? Or maternal,
So
not
that's specific to neighborhoods, what we're talking about.
for health,
Where it ranks.
disinvested
Our bad
neighborhoods
neighborhoods versus-
as compared to health, literacy and trust. So again, now we're up here. So its impact on, as compared to maternal child health. Neighborhoods as compared to health, literacy and trust.
All right. Jean, you want to start?
So we'll start on this side. So do you think health literacy, are neighborhoods more important than health literacy and trust for maternal and child health outcomes? I'm gonna do a 1. Your neighbors. You're on. 1 second. A 1.
One.
We're the 4. 1.
1/5.
1/10.
1. 110. 1.
1/5.
I'm in such a hurry to get that vote out.
1/5.
1.
Overall, consensus is the most plurality.
That would be a 1 too, wouldn't
That would be 1.
it? It wouldn't be 110.
Yeah, 1 to 1.
The ones up here.
1 is 1 on both sides.
Yeah.
Because the opposite
Oh,
Yes.
one, I'm sorry.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right, absolutely. Okay.
Thanks for getting that out.
All right. So I can give you a nice, we'll start. All right, so the next one is ranking, if you got it now, is specific morbidities against education and employment.
Kevin?
Yeah, I know. Can you repeat that again, please, so we all know?
So we're looking at specific morbidities. Again, it could be cancer rates, it could be mortality rates,
Diabetes, asthma.
presence of disease in the community, specific diseases, as compared to education and employment.
Well, to have education on that, you need good health, so I don't know what it's for.
So you'd say morbidities is a lot more important than education and employment.
You need good health, yes.
Yes,
Because you
okay.
have to achieve, you could have the smartest thing, but if you don't have good health, then I don't know.
Okay.
So you want to hear from me?
Yes.
Okay, I have no comment.
Five.
All right,
I'll
pass.
give you a 2.5.
No, you can't do 2.5.
She tried to say-
You can do a 1.
I would say the safest
One
one
means
is
the
1.
same.
Safest is 1.
One's good.
Quickly give me those two comparisons again. Keep me off.
So we're now going to compare the second row, specific morbidities. And it's as compared to education and employment. Which of those two do you think would have a greater impact on maternal and child health? If we were to address one of,
I think the health and education. Are we talking about the education and employment now, or are you on health and literacy and trust?
so you think education and employment is more important than specific morbidities?
Yes.
A little bit or a lot more?
Lot.
A lot more, so that's 10. Okay, thank you.
I'm gonna go with 1/5.
A little less?
No, so you confused me with your response to Mr. Hoffman.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah.
if you think education and employment is more important, it would be 110, a lot more important, right? Not 10?
Yes, because it's is specific morbidities is a lot less important than education and health, it's a 110.
Right, so I think that was what Mr. Hoffman said.
Is that what you said? I'm sorry, just for.
I'm the same, 110.
So I'm with, yes, I changed it, but again, I can't, because I'm understanding.
What Joe said.
We're going down the line, so, okay.
Yes, sir.
110.
110.
110.
110.
Ditto.
110.
One. I'll go with, 150.
One.
110.
110.
Dr. Martell, you figured this out for us, we don't. Okay, now, all right, good, okay. We're changing a few things on this.
It's okay.
We're not gonna,
I got it.
All right.
we're not going to the execution squad for getting wrong.
Later on it.
All right, all right.
But it really is, it's a way for us, though, when we look at strategies, is to take a look at, we're talking about disinvestment. You know, you said that was the most important. We're talking about life science. Then we might work on like programming and so on, it's important on maternal child.
I get to go through this.
Right, so we will align what we're doing. It's we have to figure out how to merge these seven into something that's manageable.
Maybe I'll understand.
Next.
Next one. So we're still going to talk about specific morbidities. And now we're going to talk as compared to health literacy and trust. Which of those two is more important? Specific morbidities is more important than health literacy and trust. We're going to do it a 1, 5, or 10.
And if I make a specific morbidity, that's the health itself, whatever is true, whatever.
The common diseases.
That's what we all know, the common diseases, thank you.
I think we start from this side this time.
Gene?
I'm getting there. I'm gonna go 110.
One.
110.
110.
1. 110.
110.
1, 5.
1, 5.
1.
What we got? 9 is a 1.
One.
Yes.
Yeah.
One's the easy answer for 1.
I mean, it ain't the same, but.
Chairman Shirley, are we cooperating here, everything going as planned?
I'll give you a 5, 6.
This is being recorded, so no
Some
comment.
difficulties.
Okay, one more cell to do on this one. Comparing education and employment, health literacy and trust.
I think we found the class.
Health literacy, is education and employment more or less important than health literacy and trust to impact maternal and child health?
Education, I think it's my turn.
Yep.
Education, employment, 10. Education, employment, 10, over health, over literacy and trust.
Education and employment.
Or health and literacy and trust. I would agree 10.
He said 10.
You said 10. 10.
10.
10. 1. 10.
1.
2 10s, a 5.
1. He's the one.
2 1s. The 10 has it, okay.
Now we know how to come out, you'll see, you know,
All right.
Two more sheets of these to do.
Two more sheets.
We have two more themes.
Now we're gonna look at impact on violence.
All right, let's roll. Keep it going.
You guys have the rhythm of this now.
Sure.
Okay. We're talking about impact on violence as the overarching, again, walking through these. So, do disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods have a greater impact or lesser impact on than specific morbidities on violence?
Perfect. Jean?
1.
10.
1.
10.
1.
10.
10.
10. 1.
10.
I want you to repeat that again, please.
Do disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods have a greater or lesser, are they greater or lesser, more or less important than specific morbidities in terms of the impact on violence?
I would 10.
Ten.
I think the 10's right now, I'm misunderstanding it, they should all be ones.
I'm gonna give you a 3. If you understand.
So that's a 10.
More, or no.
He's not ready with that, so you got it, okay.
So specific morbidities, that's natural.
Cancer,
Not accidental death, it's natural death.
no.
Illnesses.
Yeah.
Because I was
This
making
chronic
sure
disease,
shooting victims were
premature death is one of those things that falls under, but one indicator.
A lot of people look like this and then.
Okay, so, again, when we think about impact on violence, do disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods, are they more important or less important in education and employment on violence? If they're equal importance, it's a 1. Wherever you come out.
Peter, can you repeat it again, please?
Sure. So, if we look at the impact on violence, is disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods more important or less important in education and employment?
5.
5.
I would have to say a 1.
110.
1/5. 1/10. 110.
1/5.
1.
1, 10.
1/5.
1.
I don't understand that. Can I say something?
Yes.
Now, I'm thinking that if we invest in those, disinvested in vulnerable neighborhoods, wouldn't that help? Because if you invest in it, they're gonna get the education that they need. You don't think so?
I think it's the other way around.
Yeah.
So we have a tie between
1 and 1. So equal.
equal and a lot less.
So split the difference with 1/5.
That makes it a 1.
I'll be drinking.
That comes later.
That's me, that's one.
That's right.
All right, moving across. In terms of its impact on violence, are disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods more or less important than addressing health literacy and trust?
No, you start over there.
No, I already went.
Diversity more or less important than health literacy and trust.
For its impact on violence.
I'm going to give a 10.
I'm sorry, backwards, 5. I don't know.
Five.
One.
5,
5,
5,
1, 5.
10,
1, no, I changed my mind on that. Can I do the 1/5?
you can.
Okay.
5.
And then Aaron Booker came in, so.
Mr. Booker.
10.
Just 10 with some change.
I'm a 1.
Okay, thank you. Consensus is 5. Now we're going to compare for the next. We're going to come down one, specific morbidities. More or less, no, we already have that. Okay, so compared to education and employment, are morbidities more or less important than education, employment, or violence? Morbidities.
So, education and employment is more important, or not more, it would have to be more important. So I'm gonna give it a 10.
You're saying education is more important? So
Yes.
you're gonna give it a 110. A 110.
Yes,
No. 110.
yes.
1, 2.
110.
110.
110. 1/5. 5.
1/10.
110.
1/5.
110.
110.
1,
1/5.
Okay, so 110. Okay, that's 110. All right. So now we're gonna do specifically. So now we're gonna look at specific, again, comparing specific morbidities to health literacy and trust for the impact on violence. The specific morbidities of greater or lesser importance in health literacy and trust in impacting violence.
I'm gonna give it a 1.
1.
1,
1.
1.
110.
1/10.
110. 1. 110.
1.
1/5.
1, 2.
1.
1.
1.
My daughter's definitely. She's on fumes.
So now we look at education and employment. As compared to health literacy and trust. Is education and employment more or less important in health literacy and trust for the impact on violence?
More, it'll be 10.
10.
It's health literacy.
Repeat it again, maybe, it's like-
It's education and employment
Okay.
to health literacy and trust. Is education and employment more or less important than health literacy and trust?
More important, 10.
10.
1.
10.
10. 1.
5.
1.
5.
10.
1,
1.
10.
10.
Is it? We should also do this one.
You're all filled on this one.
Keep her moving.
All right, next slide.
Yes, yeah.
Now we're thinking about mental and behavioral health. Critical theme, one of our 3 priorities. We'll look at each of these again. So if you look at disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods more or less important than specific morbidities for the impact on mental and behavioral health in our community.
My turn.
Your turn.
I'm gonna give it a 1.
Oh, 10.
1.
1.
One.
One.
10.
One.
We're picking specific morbidities.
Are neighborhoods more important than specific morbidities relative to the impact on mental health?
So 10 means neighborhoods are more important.
Yes.
10.
10.
10.
1.
5.
One's have it. Okay. Moving across. Disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods as compared to education and employment. Are neighborhoods more important than education and employment for the impact on mental and behavioral health?
5. I'll give 10 to the education.
Which are, you give 10 to education, so that'd be a 110.
110.
5.
110.
110. 1/5.
1.
1.
1/5.
110.
1.
1.
Okay.
1.
1.
One's have it again. Okay. Still saying with disinvested and vulnerable neighborhoods, as compared, is it more or less important than health literacy and trust for mental and behavioral health?
All right. I'm gonna give it, neighborhoods are more important, and I'm gonna give it a 2.
10.
1.
5.
1.
1.
10.
1/5.
1. 1/5.
10.
Let's do 1/5.
1/5.
1/5.
1/5.
1/5.
All right, we're gonna move down a row. Now we're gonna compare specific morbidities. Are they more or less important than education and employment for mental and behavioral health?
For it to be blunt, I would give it a 1.
1.
I'm thinking. What category are we under?
So we're comparing, are specific morbidities more important or less important than education and employment?
Well, we're
relative to
under mental health behavior.
Mental health, to mental health.
I'd have to say 1.
110.
110. 110.
1.
110.
1/5. 1.
110. Should
110.
110. Okay. Still on specific morbidities. Now we're going to compare them to health literacy and trust. Are specific morbidities more important than health literacy and trust as it relates to mental and behavioral health?
1/5.
1/5.
1.
1.
1.
110.
1/5.
1. 1/5.
1.
1.
1/5.
1.
1/5.
1/5 has it? So it's a little less important. Okay. So we drop down to education and employment, the third row down. Coming across to health literacy and trust. This is the last one. This is the last one. All right, so is education and employment more or less important than health literacy and trust as it relates to an impact on mental and behavioral health?
Can you just repeat that again? Sure. It's nice just to hear it a second time for all of us.
Is addressing education and employment more or less important than addressing health literacy and trust to have an impact on mental and behavioral health?
I'm gonna have to go with 5.
And so I'm gonna say education and employment is most important, so that'd be the one of 10.
That would, it's a lot more important to be a 10.
Yeah.
10. 10.
10,
10, 1.
110.
5,
5,
5,
1,
110.
10.
110.
10 has it.
He's got it.
So I know that, I don't know whether that was painful or interesting exercise for you. I really appreciate you taking the time to do it. I'm not gonna have to rate how painful it was on a scale of 1 to 10.
Goes to 1.
Dr. Martel? Did you raise your hand? Oh, okay. Thought you raised your hand.
So just so that you know, what we will do, and we'll share it back with you, is we tally all those. We come up sort of with a raw score for each of those items, and then a relative score that sort of bases it off. So you can see how strongly one or another ranks to help us create rank orders among these. We've done this with superintendents. We will do this with the Board of Health. We will combine all of that together as part of the input into how we look to prioritize these things. So we have some ongoing steps to go. We'll report back to that you did. We'll give you your scores. Coming out of all this exercise and all these assessments, we compiled results, and then working with our steering committee, we developed action plans, and those then get shared out with that, again, as a community. And the goal is then to implement those initiatives and set them up in such a way that they have the data driven, that they have measurable goals or targets that we set, and then we monitor that. And we'll Are there any other questions or comments?
Greg, if we do, thank you. I know that this is not, we come back every 5 years, but it's hard when demand, we have a whole catalog of things we have to look at. And so it does help us prioritize, figure out how we can put different strategies under these different categories. And so there was no right or wrong answer. We compiled with everyone else. So if you said, for instance, disinvested neighborhoods was more important under violence, and we're working on, blight, we're working on lead abatement, we're going to put that strategy underneath that particular issue. It doesn't make it necessarily the perfect right category, but it says that's how we're going to prioritize, and that's how we prioritize our programming and align it with what the priorities of the community have been. So I think, again, we heard a lot about negative things. I don't want to get into that's all this means about. The goal of this is to look at the issues, health priorities, but the idea being that that's what we're going to be focused and working on and continuing to work on. We've got a lot of ways to go yet on those 3. So appreciate the time and effort that you put into this. I know it was challenging, and we appreciate all the comments.
What a good comes out of the bad, and then once you know what that is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just a suggestion. What the sheriff said early on in this meeting there was that subjective, these things are. And so each and every one of these things you talked about here is important. Okay, they all are. But being subjective depends on how you view that. And so this body came out with the way they view it. My suggestion would be take this whole show that you just did to a group of high school seniors. Get a senior from each one of the high schools to sit in on a meeting like this. And then do the same thing with seniors from Rock Valley College, perhaps. Get a panel with them to get the input from them. And I say this because in my own township, which is a very small township, many years ago, we did that with the vision that we wanted to get from the students at school. So we did it with sixth graders, and then we did it with the eighth graders. And their visions were very much different, even though they're only 2 years apart. Their visions of what they wanted, there's a list of things like this, there's still what was important to them. And so, the youth are the ones that are gonna be going on with this. Look at all of us. You know, our best years are behind us, most of us here. So I think you need to get the youth involved.
Write this off.
My years are best as an architect.
None of us kids anymore. Face it.
All right.
There you go.
Jeff, to a point, you're right, because many times when I'm pondering on certain issues, I will get my grandkids together, and I do it one by one to see their view of it, because it's their view of what we view. It's just sitting around this table, we all come from different neighborhoods, so we view this differently for each of our own situations. And so it's kind of neat to do, it's right to do the teenagers especially, to see how they view things. It's quite amazing. And you get an education out of it too.
I'd like to suggest that you take it to community centers where you have the teenagers there and they're playing basketball and some of the classroom.
We're gonna take these on the road to the community now. Minors are a different story because the way they're weighing in on things. But again, the idea being that you are representative of you're representative of your communities and your constituents, and how you perceive issues and problems. And again, we said there was no right, wrong answer. We compiled with all the others that are weighing in as well. The superintendents weigh in for, and the school principals weigh in for the schools. And again, you could probably spend years just continuing this prioritization, but obviously we have to work through next right is develop management plans and where we're at. So appreciate all of it. I know it's a hard night. It was hard to get through. So thank you. Much appreciate.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. All right, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Oh.
So moved.
Oh.
Second.